Hey you! Yeah, you. Have you ever wondered what the relationship is between the White House, this plantation house, and a football stadium is? Well, if you were thinking, maybe they represent the three cornerstones of American culture. Everyone knows those are politics, slavery, and throwing the old pigskin around. Well, then you'd be wrong. The correct answer is actually ancient Greece. To understand this, allow me to explain a bit about Greek culture, architecture, and how it impacts you today. First, let's take a trip to the home of democracy, Athens, Greece. Here, we will see the first great construction that we'll be analyzing this video, that being none other than the Parthenon. Constructed from 448 to 432 BC, the Parthenon is a massive structure built in quite a small time frame, in part due to the fact that it was never built from the ground up, but instead upon the ruins of a very similar temple that existed on the very same spot, but that was destroyed in the Persian invasion of Athens. In its construction, it used many recycled materials from the previous temple so as to save time and money, but also to commemorate the rich history of the site, and imagine that the older Parthenon would be reborn, larger and better than before. It then served not just as a temple to Athena as its predecessor had, but as a reminder of Athenian resilience. Sculptures were also added to the building in the form of its metopes to retell the story of the Persian war through myths, showing Greek soldiers battling centaurs as opposed to Persians, and through scenes of struggle and loss, eventually the victory over the Persians, which were now represented by beasts, was shown. The explicit purpose of this classical Doric temple is to honor and worship the goddess of war, Athena, the patron goddess of Athens from which it derives its name, but eventually it came to represent more than just a place of worship, but as a symbol of Athenian prosperity. Religion was a huge part of Greek culture and it dictated their very way of life, so it's no surprise that they would often construct huge monuments such as this dedicated to just one of their many gods. Now if you've heard me mention terms like metope and Doric and are wondering what those terms could possibly mean, then you're in luck as I can explain them now that you understand a bit of the purpose and history to the Parthenon and will soon see how they relate to it. In classical Greece, there were three main styles of architectural orders. Of them, the Doric style is the oldest, followed by the slightly more intricate Ionic style that was then followed by the complex Corinthian order. Although the Corinthian is more of a variant of the Ionic than a style of its own, so I won't really cover it further, just remember the name and know it's like Ionic but with fancy leaf decorations. And if you're starting to get confused with terminology, don't worry, it gets worse. Each temple constructed under these specific architectural orders would follow the design patterns shown to a T, with only minor variances found from temple to temple. Feel free to pause the video, take notes, and memorize the exact structural patterns of each, or just keep watching and pretend that you get it. So now that brings us back to why I chose the Parthenon, and that's because its construction is distinctly Doric, being composed of columns with simple capitals, fluted shafts, and no base to them. Above the columns sit the architrave, and above that sits the large frieze, complete with metopes commemorating the Persian war to fill the space between the triglyphs. Because of its flawless construction, it is regarded as the greatest Doric temple ever built, and it served as an important symbol of power to Athenians. Like many other Doric temples, it follows a similar internal layout, albeit a bit larger than most others, where it has rows of columns that create a walkway around the central three rooms, the centermost being the naos, or the room in which the image of the deity that the temple was constructed for resides, in this case that being Athena. What is distinct about the Parthenon is its proportions. Compared to the other temples of the style, it seems to possess more of a balanced grace, achieved through some readjusting and resizing of its components. The entablature sits lower in relation to its width and to the height of the columns themselves are much slimmer, less tapered, and their capitals too are smaller, all while the spacing between the columns has been widened. This creates a generally more spacious and airy feel to the structure as a whole, and despite its grand size, it seems lighter compared to similar temples, such as the bulkier yet smaller Temple of Poseidon. But enough about the Parthenon. Let's move a bit to the southeast to investigate another example of Greece's rich architectural heritage. Here, we can find the ruins of the sanctuary of Asclepios, or maybe it's Asclepius, or maybe it's Asclepios. Anyways, we find one of his many sanctuaries here at Epidaurus. Asclepius was the Greek god of medicine and healing, and he had multiple sanctuaries constructed in his honor, as places of healing, but also to gain his favor so that he may use his divine healing powers to help his followers fight off plagues. Of his many sanctuaries, the sanctuary at Epidaurus is argued to be the most important due to its size and the belief that it was the birthplace of Asclepius. The shrine represents multiple facets of Greek culture. It represents their deep religious beliefs, their presence in modern science and medicine, and also their love for the arts. These grounds were beautiful, yet each building served a purpose. While I did mention that the inhabitants of the sanctuary were a religious healing cult, in truth they were much more than that, as the site is regarded as the birthplace of modern medicine. An important part of healing practices involved the usage of water, so like many other sanctuaries, this one was built near sources of spring water. Treatments available included the implementation of pharmaceutical drugs, operating surgeries, and most interestingly, the inclusion of dogs that were allowed to wander freely about the grounds, and whose purpose it was to lick the open wounds of residents so that it may cleanse and heal them. As far as what occupied the grounds themselves, there was the Abaton, which is a large building for people to enter and rest from their travels and potentially even receive visions from Asclepius himself. It was also the place where surgeries would be held by the priests of the sanctuary. And the other main building, and perhaps the most important, was the Tholos, yet its particular usage is unknown. It is a building present at all sanctuaries, perhaps as a place of worship. A very interesting characteristic of the Tholos at Epidaurus is its underground maze that has many hypothesized usages, but none of them being confirmed. Aside from those, there was a gymnasium for maintaining the health of residents, an altar for making animal sacrifices to honor Asclepius, temples for worship, one to Asclepius and a smaller one to Artemis, a stadium in which games such as foot races and chariot races were held, and all of which were constructed in a distinctly Doric fashion. I did leave one part out though, as it happens to be the most impressive, and that being the massive and incredibly well-preserved theater. Generally, it was common in Greek theater that stories be either tragedies or comedies, often linked with Greek mythology, or more accurately put, the Greek religion. This particular theater, built into a naturally sloping hillside, has been praised for its impressive acoustics and exquisite size, and its purpose was not just to entertain the attendants, but it also worked its way into their healing rituals, as according to Aristotle's Poetics, tragedies dealt with the plot outlining the protagonist's reversal of fortune, evoking both fear and pity from the audience. This resulted in catharsis, and thus the audience would be purged. The main takeaway to be had from observing this theater is, well, take a look at it. Does it seem familiar? If you're thinking it just looks like any other theater, then you're right, it does, and that's the beauty of it. For centuries, the basic structure of theaters has not changed. From the theatron being a set of tiered seats that provided space for spectators, all surrounding a circular space for the chorus to perform, or the orchestra, and above that, the stage. Even the content of theatrics has hardly changed. And sure, now we have better construction habits that allow for roofs over our theaters, but that's really the main difference. And what happens if you take two of these theaters and you smack them together? That's right, you get the Roman Colosseum. Now you may be wondering how this sanctuary, the Parthenon, and modern American society are all related. Well, it takes a few steps, but stick with me here. Both the sanctuary at Epidaurus and the Parthenon represent the vibrant religion and culture of ancient Greece, and of how the Greeks would construct great monuments in honor of their gods. But more than that, they've impacted multiple societies to come, most direct being the Romans. As I mentioned, the Roman Colosseum is just two Greek theaters put end to end. But does that Colosseum look like anything else you've seen? How about like any stadium for any sport of any kind ever? From football to basketball to soccer, all these stadiums have their heritage in the construction of Greek theaters, not to mention all modern theaters being near replicas of the aforementioned Greek archetype. Aside from just inspiring the stadiums in which every sport is played on, let's take a good look at the Pantheon, one of the most recognizably Roman constructions. Does it happen to look a bit like the similarly named Parthenon? That's no coincidence. In fact, those pillars and the structure they support happen to be of perfect Corinthian construction. Now it comes as no surprise that a culture from the same region in a similar time period as the ancient Greeks would take some heavy inspiration from them, whether it be adopting their religion, architectural styles, or even their political system as their own, albeit with some minor modifications. Yet, how can we see these effects today outside of sports centers and theaters? Well, taking a big leap to the west, all the way to the very capital of the United States, we find the White House, clearly taking inspiration from the old Greek and Roman constructions. But those pillars look a bit like a crossbreed between Ionic and Corinthian columns, and that's because they are. They have the characteristic scrolls of Ionic columns, yet the spiky flares of Corinthian columns. But if you wish to find more direct representations of Greek columns, then look no further than the Midwest, where you can find a variety of perfect recreations of both Doric and Ionic columns. Even though we like to discredit the old Greek belief system by simply writing it off as pagan mythology, we can still see examples of their culture and especially their beautiful architectural styles popping up all across the United States, even in places where you'd least expect it. So whether you're taking a stroll through Louisiana, Washington, D.C., or Rome, hopefully now you'll have a little more to think about when you come across a theater, stadium, or any building sporting some beautiful columns. Here are my sources, and I would like to thank you just for watching, giving me the time, and I hope you learned a thing or two.